We've all heard the expression, a picture's worth 1,000 words. The idea is that a complex idea or message can be delivered more effectively with a single image that sort of lets you create the narrative. But does the opposite hold true? What about a single word or a few words? Can they capture 100 years, 1,000 years? And when you think about the 17th and 18th century, it's been framed the age of enlightenment for good reason. We focused on reason, science, individual exchange, democracy, and the separation of church and state. Building from the 18th and 19th centuries, the Industrial Revolution, that significant shift in economic and social structures, rapid technological advancements, urbanization, changes in labor practices. And as we close the 19th century, the concept of nationalism, this need for self-determination, redrawing borders, forming new states. 20th century, the civil rights movement, particularly in the States, secure equal rights and end racial segregation. I'd say the end of the 20th century, maybe globalization was the word, as we saw how the digital revolution could interconnect economies and cultures and societies. My question to you is, what do you think will define this century? Will it be a pandemic, artificial intelligence, upheaval, migration, climate change? Or is all of these headwinds coming together and we're going to frame it the age of complexity as we battle, or the age of creativity as we harness scientific and technological breakthroughs to solve? As an optimist, I'm hoping for the age of creativity. And this year I want to devote a few of my episodes to breakthroughs that could solve some of our biggest problems. Today I want to talk about carbon capture, a Canadian company called Deep Six, and a 33-year-old that's one of the smartest and most energetic individuals I've ever interviewed on Chatter That Matters. His name is Phil DeLuna. He's the chief carbon scientist and head of engineering at Deep Sky, a firm focused on carbon removal.
Imagine the year is 2050. It's the day that we declared victory on our fight against climate change. We live in a net zero world. Humanity finally removes more carbon from the atmosphere than we emit. But none of this is real.
But at age 33, he's managed to accomplish a few other things, including a Governor General's Gold Medal winner, materials science. He's ranked in the top 1% of the world in his field. He's a member of the College of the Royal Society of Canada, an adjunct professor of materials science and engineering at the University of Toronto, a Forbes top 30 under 30. He's worked at McKinsey, and he's also had political ambitions.
This is Chatter That Matters with Tony Chapman, presented by RBC.
Phil DeLuna, welcome to Chatter That Matters. If I can be so personal, how old are you?
I'm 32.
So how is it possible at age 32 you've accomplished so much?
I don't know. I guess I get bored easily. I always try to find a new challenge. No, honestly, I owe a lot of what I've been able to do to the mentors in my life. And whenever you see someone who's successful, or you think is successful, and they have this impressive CV, you have to remember that there are so many people that help them along the way. And no one gets to where they are on their own.
And I appreciate that. Maybe I was going to save this towards the end of the show, but we were on and talking about mentorship. And I was reading about you, and you give so much credit to both your parents and your wife. And let's just start about your parents, where they're from, and the fact that they came to Canada and all the reasons why.
Yeah, so my parents, I'm Filipino. I was born in Taiwan, actually, but my parents were temporary foreign workers there when they were around my age, or in their early 30s. They weren't supposed to have a kid, but surprise, I was born. Then I moved to Canada when I was 5 years old, grew up in Windsor, Ontario. My dad, who was an engineer in the Philippines, was an auto worker in Windsor, automotive capital of Canada, right next to Detroit. My mom, like many typical immigrant women, worked in customer service. We didn't have much money growing up. I remember one night my dad was working a night shift and my mom was working a night shift as well. And because we couldn't find or afford a babysitter, she just brought me to the hotel that she was working at, and I stayed in one of the empty rooms. I don't know to this day whether she was allowed to do that or not, but I just remember that very vividly as one of the earliest memories I have as a kid. Anyway, so dad was an auto worker, mom worked customer service.
Just hold on for a sec, because your dad was, you just rolled it off. Yeah. And I hear this so often, these immigrants coming to Canada, searching for a better life. But he was an engineer. He had that in his knapsack, and yet he's forced to do shift work. How did you feel that made him feel? Because I'm always questioning the sense of chasing a dream and then all of a sudden having cement poured on your feet.
It's interesting you ask that, because I think for both of my parents, they knew what they were giving up in order to come here, and they knew the sacrifices that they would have to make in order to give their kids a better life. And so I'm sure it was difficult. I know it was difficult. He worked shift work. There were some times where he'd be driving home from work and he'd fall asleep at the wheel at an intersection, and he wouldn't know how long he'd be out for, but he'd wake up and the light would be green and someone would be honking behind him. It could have been a few seconds. It could have been a few minutes. I hope at least what I've been able to achieve and what my sister is doing right now is some modicum of accomplishment. And my parents had always said growing up that people can take things away from you, but they can never take away what you know. And that's why education is so important. And I've always taken that to heart.
Where did the love of science come from? I mean, you roll off at age 32, and I just spent half the podcast interview talking about your resume. So it had to begin somewhere.
Yeah, I mean, I'd always loved science as a kid. Magic School Bus was my favorite TV show growing up. I would always beg my parents for some change so I could buy little chemistry kits at the Scholastic Book Fair. I don't even know if they still have those, but I remember that again. It's a walk on memory lane for me on this podcast. I don't know where it comes from, to be honest with you. I just always knew that I loved science, that it was a curiosity of mine, and that I wanted to understand the world and discover new things.
You're Filipino, you're growing up in Windsor, so you're not, I would say, part of the majority. Did you find in school that the sense of the science brain allowed you to find like-minded people and create a community? Or, this combination of your ethnicity and your love for science kind of made you not part of the cool kids, not having that table at the cafeteria everybody wanted to sit at?
Unfortunately, I would say it's the second piece. And I would actually say that I downplayed my intelligence when I was a bit of a kid. I tried to be more of a social troublemaker, very talkative, very social kind of guy. And, to be honest with you, I just wanted to belong like with everyone else. But, growing up in Windsor, I was one of the only Filipino kids, if not the only Filipino kid in my class. Again, another childhood memory. I remember coming to school with this adobo chicken and fried rice for lunch. Today, I'm like craving it just talking about it. But when I was a kid, I was like, I just want a peanut butter and jelly sandwich with the kid next to me. I can't trade any of my food with them. And so I remember like shamefully, before lunch would start, I threw it out. I threw out the chicken and rice because I didn't want my classmates to know that that's what I was bringing. And I just pretend like I didn't have anything that day. I didn't hide away from being smart or anything like that. But, I thought that there was the stereotype of, yes, he's Asian, so he has to be good at math. And if there's one thing you'll know about me, you can see it in my career, I hate to be pegged in any one box. I hate to be called any one thing. And so I'm always constantly trying to improve and reinvent and evolve myself.
And did you ever take that troublemaker out of you? Because I first was reading about you. I said, this is going to be a very serious interview, but this is going to be a lot of fun. I mean, did it ever leave you? Or is that kind of one of the things that defines you, is the sense that status quo, process and rules aren't necessarily the best way to lead someone of your pedigree?
Absolutely. It's absolutely something that's defined me. And it's something that I've had to keep in check. It's interesting. When I was at the National Research Council of Canada, for example, when I was working in the government, I often felt that I was pushing the boundaries and I was frustrated by the pace that the government was moving at. And I was seen as this sort of young, and it's funny because when you go into a large organization that is hierarchical, being a young person, you can be discounted because you don't necessarily have experience. But I would actually take that on its head and say, okay, I'm young, so I don't know any better. Why don't we try this? Why don't we do that? And oftentimes it would work. I would do things that were, bending the rules in some ways, but they were effective. And then people would just chalk it up. Oh, he's just young and he doesn't have kids yet. He doesn't know the way the world works, et cetera, et cetera. And I would take that and I would use it. So, being a little bit of a troublemaker, I don't think that part has ever really left me. And I inherit that, a little bit of that from my parents as well. That, my dad has had a rebellious streak. He's always controversial, always talking at the dinner table about whatever the latest political thing was to rile people up. And I don't know if he ever believed anything he said. He just wanted to see a reaction. So I think I've kept a bit of that.
Talk to me a little bit about university. You go for your master's in science, and along the way, you say, I'm probably to your teacher, I'm pretty excited. I'm going to go after my PhD. And they say you're not good enough. That's almost like Delco Records saying to the Beatles, we think guitar and rock and roll bands are done. What do you do as a young person? Because there's a lot of young people that get rejected all the time, as you said, because of their age or their stigma. Like, what did you do to kind of use that to your advantage?
Yeah. So for a bit of context, I did my master's at the University of Ottawa, and I did it in computational chemistry, using computers to solve chemistry problems. And in that field, my professor was this guy who was really interested in method development. There's kind of two types of people in the space. Those who like to code and build the tools, and those who like to apply them. I'm more of an application guy. I'm big picture thinking, less on the details. And so we clashed. And it was a very valuable lesson for me, actually, which was understand the people that you work with, the people that are your mentors, your supervisors, their working style, what they value, how they operate, and make sure that it matches with what you want. And in that situation, it just didn't match. And, I think he was probably judging my coding ability. I'm not the best at Python. And he felt, this guy's not going to be good enough to do a PhD. Despite the fact, by the way, that I had published a couple of papers in my master's, more so than anyone else in my cohort. I took that as a piece of evidence, right? Like I was very analytical about it. And I said, okay, do I want to do this? The answer had always been yes, 100%. Am I going to let this guy tell me that I can't? And then I looked at, okay, do I have the intrinsics to do this? I have publications. I think about things. And so I decided, screw it. I'm going to apply to every single university that's better than this one. I'm going to have the best PhD. I'm going to publish more papers than this guy's ever published in his life. And I did. And, it's funny to say, but spite can be a very strong motivational factor sometimes. And I certainly used it then. A
lot of people maybe that are sports fans won't understand this, but I do because I've actually had the privilege of talking to some PhDs. I mean, you were published over 50 times in university, cited over 16,000 times. I mean, those are kind of Michael Jordan numbers, aren't they? That's a lot of effort and a lot of thinking and a lot of peer-to-peer reviews giving you thumbs up.
Yeah, a lot of writing, a lot of writing. No, I mean, I was very lucky and to land at a university with a professor who believes in me. My PhD supervisor was Professor Ted Sargent, and he's a bit of a savant himself. He's not a typical academic. He runs his lab like a company. You have deliverables, you have hierarchy, you have projects that have strict timelines and stage gates. It taught me a lot about how high operating organizations function and entrepreneurial organizations function, but it was all within the academic setting, so we had a lot more freedom. And I was able to publish a few papers, multiple in Science and Nature with that professor. Again, it was about the team atmosphere, about leaning on and building upon the work that others had done before you. I owe a lot of my career to Ted.
I do find it's challenging to recreate the excitement and atmosphere you had in that lab. You talked about going to the research council and such. You're the young person. I mean, do you ever go, that's the kind of situation I always want to set myself up in, where you have conditions for success versus just conditions to impress?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think a lot of what people want in their life, ultimately, yes, compensation is fantastic and it's great. You have to feed your family. But I think people want to feel that the work that they do matters and that they have control over their own destiny. So purpose and autonomy. And while I was at the NRC, I definitely felt that the work that I did mattered. It was, I was serving my country. And what I didn't perhaps share is I also ran for office in the 2021 federal election. And a part of that, being an immigrant coming to Canada, I don't think my life story could have been possible in any other country. And so I feel an immense amount of debt to this nation. And I love Canada with every fiber of my being. So being able to work and use my skills to help the public good was so fulfilling. But the lack of autonomy was honestly crushing. And so it was that balance between the rebel, the troublemaker, the one who wanted to go do things, and the intelligent, logical, sort of effective person. And I think there's that struggle inside me all the time. And the places that I thrive the most is where those two people are happy.
Where did this whole fascination with carbon capture begin?
One of the reasons I went to do my master's with this professor was because of the type of research that he was doing. I went to an undergraduate conference and he was showing his research on screen, giving a presentation, and he was discovering new materials to capture carbon dioxide. And at the time, a lot of people thought this was going to be too expensive. It was never going to work, etc. And it has completely blown up as a field since then. But the very first time I thought about, using or the things that I would be excited about doing in my life, I knew it was about chemistry. I knew I wanted to do material science because I didn't really like organic chemistry very much. And then when I thought about materials and looked into it further, you could go down the electronics path, you could go down structural materials, functional materials. Then I realized that underlying all of these things is that, yes, materials are key to the quality of life that we have, but they've also led to an incredible problem that we face, which is climate change. And we have to rethink and reimagine the ways that we build the things that we use, the materials, the way that we make them. And so my fascination with carbon capture started with, okay, actually, it's going to be very difficult to completely reimagine every single thing that we've done. There's so much sunk cost, so many ways and entrenched supply chains that you're going to have to tear down and build back up, which would lead to social unrest. And so if you can't change that quickly, and we have to deal with climate change quickly, then why don't we at least capture the emissions, either before it hits the atmosphere or remove it once it's already in there.
So let's talk a little bit about carbon, and we'll weave in some of the work you're doing right now. But in this century, my opening, I talk about sort of one or two words that define centuries, the age of enlightenment, the industrial revolution, globalization. And I would argue that either this is going to be the age of complexity because we have so many problems to deal with, or climate change. Yet when I read out there's so many people still denying climate change. And I don't know if that's just because of social media. That's because the problem seems so big that or it's becoming very personal because I have to pay taxes on it. But why do you think we are still at a point where the concept remains intangible and therefore easy to debate?
There's something interesting about humanity and our psyche in general, that no matter what topic, there are going to be people who disagree. We still have folks who truly believe that the world is flat, right? Like incontrovertible scientific evidence that you can see, touch, feel. It's increasingly becoming clear with climate change. That's the same thing. Look outside. Look at what happened this summer. Look what's happening right now in the winter. It's one of the warmest winters. When I was in Ottawa doing my master's, I could skate on the Rideau Canal. You're not able to skate. You haven't been able to skate on the Rideau Canal for a few years now because of how warm it's getting. So why do I think that's the case? I think there's a few things. There's the very slim population that no matter what topic, no matter anything, there's going to be something that's hardwired in folks to disagree.
Sounds like your dad, by the way.
Yeah, a little bit, honestly, in many ways. There's going to be a subset of the population whose livelihoods depend on the way that things were done before, and who see the energy transition or who see addressing climate change as a threat to their way of life or a threat to their economic security. And that's true in fossil fuel producing nations, Canada being one of them. And that's true across people, again, whose livelihoods depend on being able to get to work every day. And they're just looking at the gas prices increase and inflation, which, by the way, has been proven isn't actually very much tied to the carbon tax. The carbon tax only accounts for about 2% of inflationary pressures on the index. But in any case, I think it really comes down to those two things, being hardwired to disagree and also seeing this as a threat rather than the opportunity that it actually is.
So talk to me about the Kyoto Protocol, the Paris Agreement 2015, the COP conferences. It seems to be that the narrative has changed from leaders shedding their self-interest to becoming much more, the way the media presents it often is, a lot of jet setters in their private jets showing up and not really getting beyond rhetoric. Do you think that we are seeing progress on a global stage where there'll be less talk and more action?
All we have to do is look at the numbers, right? In terms of the number of policies that have been announced, the number of private corporations that have set net zero targets. So first, let me address your comment about this is just the World Economic Forum, but for climate, right? Like a bunch of jet setters coming down. Yeah. So I went to COP28 this year, and it was the first time that I'd ever been. And I was excited, right? I mean, this is the Super Bowl for climate nerds. And when I went, I was surprised. The thing that struck me the most was not the number of jet setters or celebrities, but the number of policymakers, municipal workers, public servants from every single country in the world coming together, focused on one problem. And it was actually quite beautiful because, you would have, you had representatives from low-lying Caribbean states who were worried, like quite seriously about whether or not their country will exist, to oil and gas petro states in the Middle East who are thinking about how do they transition away in a world that they know will have to wean itself off of oil and gas, and they're all together. So, what is the value of something like this? The value is having a forum where literally every single person, every country in the world can come and be represented and have a discussion and try to make progress on climate. The thing that we don't want is for rogue states or for a part of the world to not care, to not do anything, to not feel the pressure from the rest of the global community. Because climate change, emissions, just like COVID, does not know borders. So unless we have these gatherings and unless we actually talk to one another, and by the way, in a society that is increasingly, in a world that is increasingly becoming more polarized and fractious, if we don't have this place for us to have this conversation and try to find common ground, then there's no hope for us to make action at all.
But you could argue that Canada has, stood on this topic for quite some time, but the math would suggest we've really made very little progress.
And you wouldn't be wrong. And it's one of the biggest disappointments that I have in Canada in general, is the lack of progress. But we have to recognize a few things. When we think about the climate reduction goals, it's often towards a baseline, 50% from this year, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. We have a very low baseline compared to other countries because our electricity grid is relatively clean, the majority of which is actually hydroelectric. There's a little bit of coal or a little bit of oil and natural gas. We outphase coal before we set our targets. So other countries, all they have to do, it's not all they have to do, it's a difficult thing, but they can address much of their emission reduction targets that are low-hanging fruit before 2030 by switching their electricity production from coal to other sources, renewables, even natural gas. They'll lower their emissions. We don't have that luxury. So we're starting off at a very low point and are asked to decrease even further down. That's one. Two is it takes a long time to do this. We have a cold climate where we have to heat our homes and population. We have an infrastructure that needs to be built out even further in order to electrify heating around the country. And we have immense population increases that many can argue are leading to inflationary pressures, costs of living crises, affordability. And that has a ripple effect on how we're able to decarbonize per capita as a country. Because the more people that we have, the more energy that we need. Do I think that we could be doing more? Yes, 100%. Do I wish we were? Of course. But I do think that we're starting on a pathway. And a lot of it, I'll give credit to trying to keep up with the United States, with their Inflation Reduction Act that the Biden administration passed a couple of years ago, which was a massive subsidy, one of the largest climate tech bills ever passed in the world. And so Canada has come forward with a few of their own targeted investment tax credits to help spur the industry, like the carbon capture, utilization, and storage tax credit. And so Canada is doing its part in trying to remain competitive, trying to keep up in this transition, and really walk that laser thin tightrope between what is politically palatable and what can actually drive emissions down fast enough.
Before I get into your work with Deep Sky, my last question is carbon tax, which seems to be so polarizing. Is that something you buy into in terms of a strategy from moving forward, or do you think there's a better path to accomplishing our goals?
So if you're an academic, if you're an economist, and I love economists, no offense to economists, the carbon tax is the best thing in the world because it is a broad-based, market-driven thing. You set a tax, you don't choose an industry, you don't give subsidies away, you just let the market do its thing. Free market capitalism at its greatest. The biggest issue so far with the carbon tax has been that it hasn't been high enough to actually influence factors. It was a half measure. They set the carbon tax too low. Well, maybe I'll put it this way. If the carbon tax was introduced in the 1980s at the prices that we had now, it would have been perfect because it would have been a slow ramp up. We would have been able to decrease emissions at the same time as have this carbon tax. And in many ways, that's what they did with acid rain emissions. And we were very effective at decreasing acid rain, NOx and SOx, these sorts of things in the 80s. And also, we never hear about the ozone being depleted anymore because we were able to deal with that with chlorofluorocarbons, CFCs, the biggest contributor to ozone depletion. But when it comes to CO2 emissions, we weren't able to do that early enough. So the carbon tax that exists today in Canada or anywhere else in the world, in my view, is a half measure because it's not biting enough to actually spur change. And so I think the time for the carbon tax, unfortunately, has passed. We live in a complex world that is no longer governed by economic equations and ideal free market capitalism. We live in an emotional world. We live in a political world. And so I actually think what the United States has done by creating incentives, carrots rather than sticks, and having a bit more of a hand in shaping the industrial policy and the destiny of its country and how it will at least try to meet the challenge of this energy transition is what we should be doing here. And we've started to do that. We've started to see that with these investment tax credits. But I think one of the worst things, frankly, that the Trudeau administration could have done was the carve out for Atlantic provinces on home heating oil, because that's exactly what you're not supposed to do on a broad-based free market tool like a tax, is erect or create carve-outs.
You become the chief carbon scientist in engineering at Deep Sky. I have to imagine at age 32, with what's in your resume, with the work you published, you had a lot of doors that you could have gone through. What made you choose Deep Sky?
Purpose and autonomy. At Deep Sky, it's the first time in my career, since my PhD actually, where I feel that I have both the purpose in the work that I do, but also the freedom and the autonomy to drive things, and that I am my own limiting factor. Not the organization, not the rules that were there before me, but myself. And so the story of how I came to be at Deep Sky, I was at McKinsey and I was getting a little bit frustrated. I knew that it was an interesting role and I was having a lot of fun, but I wanted to do something on my own. So I was actually thinking of starting my own company, of starting a carbon removal company. And as an adjunct professor at the University of Toronto, I had a colleague of mine who had made a recent discovery. He was going to patent a new technology. I was going to license it. I was going to go start a company. And I met the folks at Deep Sky because Deep Sky is a technology agnostic project developer. And I met the founders, Fred Lalonde and Joost Overkirk. And what they were doing is they were going around the world trying to find people who were developing carbon capture technology, carbon removal technology, to bring them to Canada to scale it. And so I met them and I thought, okay, I'm going to wow them. They came to the University of Toronto. I showed them the technology. They said it was amazing. I thought they were going to fund my startup, pre-purchase my first pallet, and I'd be off to the races. Instead, they said, Phil, come join us. Join our mission. We already have the funding, so you're not going to have to spend the first 2 years of your startup career in the worst venture capital raise environment ever. And in a few years, if you still want to go start your company, we'll support you. And I talked earlier about finding mentors and people who believe in you and that will support you. And you know it when you see it. And I felt it immediately. So I've never really followed a role or an organization or compensation. I followed people, and people that I feel that I could really learn from. And these were folks that, for context, Fred and Joost co-founded a company called Hopper, which is a $5 billion Canadian tech company in the travel space. They sell travel. They're a competitor to Expedia. And so, I felt that I could really learn from people who had built billion-dollar businesses before. And then so I left McKinsey, and it's been a rocket ship ever since.
I love when you talked about, I'm not sure if it was in your obituary or wiki page, but how you want to be remembered. It's funny at age 32, you're already thinking about that, but it's quite interesting. It had nothing to do with your awards. It had nothing to do with your ranking. It had everything to do with how many tons of carbon you've captured.
Yeah, I always joke. I say, on my Wikipedia page when I die, I wanted to say Phil DeLuna is responsible for X tons of CO2 removed from the atmosphere. And, it's this North Star objective. People are aided by having these points of focus, right? Whether it's a deadline that you're striving towards or an objective or goal, it really does help get people to be effective. I've found a way to have a very simple metric, tons of carbon removed from the atmosphere that I can monitor, measure, and track, and that I could put my life against.
And is carbon capture going to be the magic bullet, the panacea that's going to absolutely make a massive impact on the quality of our planet?
No, the answer is no. And no one solution is going to be. It's a combination of every single lever that we can pull. And so first, let me talk about, my 5-step plan for us to save the world. And then I can talk about carbon capture as part of that 5-step plan. So the first step is protect what we have. We need to stop deforestation, cutting down the Amazon, the lungs of the world that give us our oxygen. We need to protect them. The second thing is we need to have renewables everywhere. We need to scale up the renewables as quickly as possible. Solar today is cheaper, and wind is cheaper than many forms of fossil fuel electricity, and that's a good thing. So we have to get going and start building. The third step is to electrify everything we possibly can. In Canada, we have really cold winters. And right now we use natural gas to heat our homes when we could be using electric heat pumps instead. So we have to retrofit every single building in this country, which is a massive undertaking. We need to transition away from gas guzzling internal combustion engines to electric vehicles. Electrify as much of the world as we can with those clean and green electrons in step 2. In step 4 is once we've electrified as much as we can, we have to tackle hard to abate sectors that are impossible or difficult to electrify. Things like freight or aviation, flight. We can make new sustainable aviation fuels. Concrete. We can embed carbon dioxide into a concrete or make green concrete. So all of these materials that me being a material scientist that gets so excited about, we have to find new ways to make those. And then step 5, finally, once we've done all of those things, is capture carbon. And we have to capture carbon both from the flue stack, from its point source of emission. So in all of these factories and these big chimneys that you see in TV, we have to capture CO2 before it hits the atmosphere. And we actually have to remove carbon dioxide that already exists in the atmosphere and take it out. So those are the 5 things that we have to do. Protect what we have, renewables everywhere, electrify everything, tackle hard to abate emissions, and then capture the carbon that remains.
When we return, Phil DeLuna offers some compelling advice for anyone on how to chase their dreams, and then I provide my 3 takeaways. Hi, it's Tony Chapman, host of Chatter That Matters. I want to congratulate RBC on the launch of the RBC Climate Action Institute. Canada needs more dedicated approaches to climate policy and action across agriculture, energy systems, buildings, and the RBC Climate Action Institute will be the place for advancing climate-smart ideas to help Canada reach net zero. Mother Nature and the future of our planet, well, that matters to you, to me, and to RBC.
Unfortunately, today we are divided. One side is fighting for the eradication of an entire industry. The other side is fighting just to preserve itself. For me, it's never been an issue of us versus them. We urgently need to move away from this thinking of us versus them and come together against the real problem, us versus the emissions.
You're listening to Chatter That Matters with Tony Chapman, presented by RBC.
Phil DeLuna is my guest today. There's few I've ever met in my entire life, let alone on Chatter That Matters, that has this intellectual firepower with this incredible emotional connection to the human race. Just listening to you, do you think you're going to once again put on your hat and run for office and sort of drive this change with this kind of conviction? Because you come at a very pragmatic basis. You understand there's capitalism involved. You understand that there's political rhetoric involved. I mean, there's a lot of things that you get. Do you see that one day you might go back into the ring?
Not now, because of the work that I'm doing at Deep Sky is so meaningful. It's a way that I can make change. Even in politics, you're confined by your party. You're confined by the public opinion, by the rhetoric and what you can do. A lot of people think that, Justin Trudeau is the source of all of our problems and he's this all-powerful scourge or something. But the reality is even he is just trying to stay afloat like everyone else. He's trying to keep his head above water. And so to answer your question directly, would I run again? I think, yeah, absolutely 100%, because I still believe in the political process, in the democratic process. I believe that if we don't have pragmatic, experienced, well-thinking people who lead this country, then what will we have left? We'll just have career politicians who know how to divide people and who know how to highlight problems rather than find solutions. And I think that's very dangerous for our country. But will I do it now? No. I'm too excited, too entranced, too focused and obsessed with the work that I'm doing to give that up and then to go through the grueling process and heartbreaking one of running for office again. Although if there's anyone listening out there who's ever thought of doing it, please do it because we need more people of every walk of life. We need more nurses and plumbers and teachers and carpenters and scientists and doctors and engineers and everyone running for office. Because again, if we don't have regular people running for office, then what will we have left?
As we close out the interview, time and time again, I've seen you give credit to your wife. You gave credit to your parents earlier in this interview. What role has your wife played in allowing you to find this sense of purpose and autonomy?
It's corny and it's so cliche, but I really would not be the person I am today if it wasn't for her. And I'll give a few examples in my career. So where her influence, her support has meant everything to me and has enabled me to do what I can do. In my PhD, so I thought I was going to be a professor. I thought I was going to go on the academic path. And I was publishing all these papers. I was on that pathway. And then halfway through my PhD, my wife, who, my girlfriend at the time, said, Phil, she's from Toronto. She works at Sick Kids. She's an operating room nurse. She loves her job. We have our friends here. She wanted to build a life here. And if you're in academia, anyone who's in academia knows, if you want to be a professor, you can't choose where you live. You go do your PhD somewhere, you go do a postdoc in some top 5 school around the world, and you get a job in who knows whereville, just wherever you can get one. And then she said, Phil, I want to stay in Toronto. And I made that decision then that I wanted to be with her more than I wanted to be a professor. And it catapulted me down this unconventional and much more fulfilling career, I think, than if I had just gone down academia. When I decided that I wanted to run for office, the thing that made me the most nervous was actually telling her, hey, this is something I think I want to do. Keep in mind, I had to take 6 months off without pay. I had to give up my paycheck because I was working for the federal government. So it was a conflict of interest. And at that time, we had no idea when the election was going to be called. So I was taking time off, and it could have been 6 months. It could have been a year. She said, we're going to make it work. We'll figure it out. And I support you 100%. So, having someone that you can come home to, that you can talk to, that doesn't necessarily know your field or is going to debate you on everything, but can just listen and support and be empathetic, has meant everything to me. And we got married in September. We went. It was the first time I'd taken 3 weeks off of work in my career. We went to Italy, and I actually unplugged. And I could say it was probably the happiest I've been in my life.
You're 32, and I've talked to a lot of young people, and I would say, sadly, the vast majority don't have the shining eyes that you do. They don't have this sense of passion. They don't have this excitement about what you're doing. What advice can you give to the young people today who might be feeling very beaten down by the headwinds, that there is opportunity to have, as you call it, purpose and autonomy, and a great life?
You can have purpose and you can have autonomy. Anyone can do it. You just have to want it hard enough and try. And I know that sounds so privileged in the sense that, people have bills to pay. They probably have families to feed. Why are you telling people to just take risks and try? a big unlock in my career and my life was for applying for things and trying and reaching for things that I knew I wasn't qualified to do. Because you'd be surprised the number of people that post applications or that post jobs where they know that no one is going to be able to meet it and they're just looking for the best available. And oftentimes people are their own worst enemy. They say, I'm not qualified for this. I'm not ready for this. And they just they don't take the step to try. And so like, I've always believed that in one's career, you need to optimize for different things in order to find the purpose and autonomy. When you're younger in your career, you need to optimize for diversity of experience and try as many different things as possible. A lot of people will think, oh, Phil, you haven't been able to stand still. You've done one thing. The longest you've stayed at a place is 3 years. Aren't you worried that that's going to look badly in your career? No, if anything, if you look at the career trajectory, every pivot that I've taken hasn't been a pivot downward. It's been a pivot up. And you have to take that perspective of always constantly trying to find new things that are going to excite you. And don't rest and allow the world to beat you down in a position or a place that you don't feel utilized. If you don't feel happy, if you don't feel excited about what you do, then try something else. And it could be something completely different. Like you could be a scientist doing your PhD and decide that you watched The Bear and you want to go become a Michelin-starred chef and go start learning how to cook and go work in a restaurant. It doesn't matter. Just keep trying different things until you find the thing that you love. I think that's what you have to do when you're young. Then you move into the mid part of your career where I think a lot of people are focused on impact. You found the thing that you love. How do you figure out how to turn that into something that's impactful? And that a lot of people transition away from being an individual contributor to a manager or into a leadership role, and people stumble through how to become a leader and leading through example and making impact. And then in the last stage of one's career, I think a lot of people are focused on legacy. What is it that you want to leave the world behind? What is it you want to be known for? And those three stages, thinking about, where you are in your life, in your career, what you want to do, working backwards from where you want to be. Those are all things that have helped me plan and map things out. And I should say that my life was never really purely mapped out. There were lots of failures along the way and lots of turns that I didn't expect. It looks like a perfectly planned travel experience on paper, but that's not the way it was. So again, my advice for young people at any stage is just keep trying until you find the thing you love, and don't be afraid to fail.
Phil, I always end my podcast with my 3 takeaways and put this number 1, just listen to you. You really talk about life as this accordion that opens up. And as you get on, you get into leadership and then legacy. And what really interests me about you is this accordion comes together. Here's the 5 things we need to do about the planet. Here's the 3 things you should be thinking about. It's like you're almost a fusion of the past, present, and future. And I find that incredibly fascinating about you. And the second is you're just this great student of human nature. I love when you said early on, spite can be a motivator, or here's what you'll be thinking about, and your curiosity of human nature is another fascinating thing about it, because I don't often associate that with scientific nature, scientific nature is much more process driven. And the third thing which is the sense of purpose and autonomy, something you landed on, but more importantly, landed on because you give credit to the people that matter most to you, starting with your parents, obviously your wife, and of course, what you did with just finding mentors through university and finding mentors where you are today. So for all of that and more, at age 33, I hope I'm around for another 33 years just to see how much carbon you take out of this planet, how much of this government you get to run, and just continue to follow your trajectory. And I am so happy you're in Canada and love Canada, because you're sadly the kind of person that can very easily get picked off by countries that might be a little bit more advanced in terms of providing the capital to keep minds like yours gainfully thinking and employed. So thank you for joining me on Chatter That Matters.
Canada is the best country in the world. It really is. It really, really is. And a lot of people, it's very Canadian to be shy and to not say it and to be humble. But it really is the best country in the world, and I wouldn't be anywhere else. And I think we all have a duty to make it better and to keep it the best country in the world. I hope everyone does their part to do that.
Joining me now is John Stackhouse. I first met John when he was editor-in-chief of the Globe and Mail. Today he's the senior vice president in the office of the president of RBC. John, welcome back to Chatter That Matters.
Always good to be with you, Tony. Thanks.
What I'm fascinated with is what you're doing with this Climate Action Institute, because you're opening the doors and inviting the world to be part of the conversation.
Yeah, the key part of the Institute is that word action. We feel and we hear from a lot of people, there's a lot of talk. It's important to discuss, debate, and inform a lot of critical questions around climate. But we got to get moving and get moving right across the economy. As we know, the climate crisis and all the challenges that come with it are on all of us to get going on. So we're working with clients. We're trying to bring together communities and help Canadians act and move faster, which we know Canadians not only want to do, we're already seeing it across the economy. We just need to scale it up and accelerate.
What I like about what you're doing is that you're trying to get this conversation happening so that it's not us feeling helpless, which is what I think a lot of the media is doing. It's too late, but you're keeping this positivity and possibility, saying if we start acting now, putting dents into this problem, that our collective energy can in fact not only solve it, also create a renaissance in terms of what capitalism stands for, which is a social conscience, doing the right thing.
Yeah, and I agree fully, Tony. I think one of the things we underestimate is the power of business and of markets to drive change. We're seeing extraordinary change in the United States, in large part because of the Inflation Reduction Act. But that has created incentives and unblocked disincentives for industry, whether it's in scaling electric vehicles or expanding hydrogen, or to invest in what's called climate smart agriculture with a speed and scale that is really breathtaking. So when we talk to clients or groups in the US, we want to ensure Canadians are keeping pace with that. And we can. I get to deal with a lot of RBC's best clients, whether it's in real estate or energy systems, from electricity to oil and gas to agriculture. And the amount of innovation going on across the economy, from farmers to gas companies to developers, is really impressive. It's as good as anywhere in the world. But we have to come back to that point and remind ourselves of speed and scale. How are we going to do this bigger and faster? Because the challenges are right before us. They are bigger, and planet Earth keeps reminding us that we don't have as much time as perhaps we'd like.
So as an invitation to my listeners to get involved, is there an opportunity for them to learn more about what you're doing, to participate, take action? Or is this more sort of in the inner circle of just the sort of people with the greater influence?
No, this is on all of us. And I love the advice of Catherine Hayhoe. She's a climate scientist, a great Canadian. She teaches in Texas and is a world leader in terms of climate advocacy. And she likes to remind her followers, especially on social media, that you can do something right now. You can do something today. Talk about it. It actually matters. Join climate action groups in your neighborhood, in your community, in your company, or in your sector. You'll find them everywhere. Get involved. Don't leave this to the scientists and politicians. They're going to do a lot, but this really is on all of us. Also, join what we're trying to build in the Climate Action Institute at RBC. Come to our website. Just Google RBC and Climate Action Institute. You'll find us. Sign up for our weekly newsletter called Climate Signals, which has a lot of really interesting ideas and insights on what we can all be doing and what we should be watching. And listen to our podcast, RBC Disruptors, which has a lot of great climate conversations.
I've known you for probably 20 years. I certainly saw you in the editor-in-chief of Globe and Mail. I've never seen you more passionate and more focused about a body of work that you're involved with. So thank you for joining me in Chatter That Matters.
Thank you, Tony.
Chatter That Matters has been a presentation of RBC.
I know, this can feel overwhelming. Just know that you're not alone. The best thing that you can do is talk to your loved ones about climate change. Every CEO that I've talked to has had their minds and their hearts changed at the dining room table with a conversation with their grandkids. The stakes are high, but so too is the opportunity. And we are fighting, not for ourselves, but for the generations to come.
It's Tony Chapman. Thanks for listening. Let's chat soon.